And he went back in our pastor's office, and then I heard two shots. It wasn't a minute, and I heard two shots, and so I just got everybody out.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we revisit a case that left an entire community in shock, a tragedy that unfolded in a place meant for peace, worship, and reflection. It is the story of a respected pastor, a decorated Vietnam veteran, an educator, and a community leader, who was gunned down not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by his own brother. This is the life and death of Reverend William B. Schooler. On the surface, it seemed unimaginable. A Sunday service in Dayton, Ohio, filled with hymns, prayers, and faithful voices. Families gathered in the pews, the choir lifting its song, preparing for the sermon that was to follow. But before the congregation could hear the words of their pastor, a sudden burst of gunfire tore through the sanctuary's peace. In a matter of moments, the Reverend was gone, and at the center of it all stood his brother, Daniel Gregory Schooler. How did it come to this? What kind of pain, conflict, or history could drive one brother to end the life of another in so violent a way? What led to a pastor's death inside the very church he was entrusted to guide? These are the questions that have lingered ever since that day in February 2016. Reverend Schooler was not just a man of the cloth. He was a soldier who had served his country with honor in Vietnam. He was an educator who had shaped young lives in Dayton's schools. He was a leader who sat on the city's education board and stood at the forefront of the Baptist Ministers' Union. For many, he represented faith, guidance, and a steady hand in uncertain times. His brother, Daniel, lived a very different story. At 68 years old, Daniel carried with him a long history of conflict, arrests, and documented struggles with mental health. He had grievances with his family that stretched back years, disputes over money and inheritance that had never been resolved. While Reverend William devoted his life to healing and teaching, Daniel wrestled with anger and resentment that seemed to grow heavier with time. On February 28, 2016, those two paths collided in the most devastating way imaginable. As the choir sang and worshippers prayed, Daniel entered his brother's office and opened fire. The sound of gunshots sent the congregation into chaos. Within moments, Reverend Schooler's life was over. Police rushed to the scene, but the tragedy had already taken its toll. Daniel did not flee. He was taken into custody right there inside the church. The congregation was left stunned, the community was left grieving, and a family was left broken in a way that could never be repaired. In this episode, we will walk carefully through the life of Reverend William Schooler, the troubled history of his brother Daniel, the events that led to the shooting inside St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church, and the impact this case left behind. If you value thoughtful explorations of true crime stories and the lessons they leave us, I encourage you now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. This is a story of family, faith, and a devastating act that no one who was present will ever forget. To understand the weight of this tragedy, we must begin with the man whose life was cut short, Reverend William B. Schooler. Born in 1945, William grew up in Dayton, Ohio, a city known for its working-class spirit and its resilience through decades of change. From an early age, he was marked by a sense of duty and service. That duty carried him far from home, into the jungles of Vietnam, where he served his country during a turbulent war. He returned from that conflict not only alive but decorated, a man who had faced the harshest realities of battle and emerged with an even stronger resolve to make his life meaningful. In the years that followed, William became an educator. He worked as a teacher and later as a principal, shaping the lives of countless young people in Dayton. He believed deeply in education as a way to open doors, to give children opportunities he knew were essential for survival and success. His influence was felt not only in the classroom but throughout the community, as he later rose to serve on Dayton's Board of Education. Yet William's life was not defined by education alone. His true calling was ministry. As the pastor of St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church, he led his congregation with a steady hand and a compassionate heart. To those who filled the pews every Sunday, he was not only a preacher of Scripture, but also a counselor, a mentor, and at times a father figure. His words carried weight, and his presence inspired trust. Beyond the walls of his church, he was a respected leader, serving as president of the Baptist Ministers' Union in Dayton, a role that made him a central figure in the city's faith community. But while William's life was marked by stability and service, the life of his younger brother, Daniel Gregory Schooler, told a very different story. Daniel was 68 years old at the time of the crime. For much of his adult life, he had lived under the shadow of mental health struggles. Family members and acquaintances described him as unpredictable, sometimes volatile. His criminal record showed a pattern of violent outbursts, assault charges, threats, even incidents involving weapons. These were not isolated events, but part of a troubled history that revealed how deeply he struggled to control his impulses. Adding to this was a long-standing dispute within the family. In 2011, Daniel filed a lawsuit against the church and against his relatives, claiming that he was owed proceeds from property tied to inheritance. That lawsuit was dismissed, but the bitterness remained. To Daniel, the sense of being wronged did not fade. Resentment lingered, feeding his anger toward his brother William. Here were two brothers whose lives could not have been more different. William, the pastor, the veteran, the leader, known for his discipline and care. Daniel, the brother who lived with conflict, a man often at odds with others, whose anger seemed never far from the surface. And yet, they were bound by blood, by family history, and by unresolved tensions that stretched across decades. By the winter of 2016, those tensions had reached a breaking point. Inside the walls of St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church, on a Sunday morning meant for prayer and peace, the story of these two brothers would collide in an irreversible act of violence. February 28, 2016. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in Dayton, Ohio. The pews of St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church began to fill with the faithful, families sitting side by side, hymnals in hand, preparing their hearts for worship. Reverend William B. Schooler, as always, was present, his presence calm, reassuring, steady. To his congregation, this was not just another Sunday. It was a chance to gather, to pray, to find comfort in the words of a man they trusted deeply. But in the shadows of that morning, something far darker was moving. Daniel Gregory Schooler, William's younger brother, made his way toward the church. For Daniel, this day was not about worship. It was about confrontation. The years of resentment, the bitterness over money, the mental battles he carried silently within himself, all of it had led him to this moment. As the service began, nothing appeared unusual. Voices lifted in prayer, the choir's songs filled the sanctuary, and the congregation bowed their heads in devotion. To the church members, it was the rhythm of faith. To William, it was his life's work unfolding once again before him. But Daniel was waiting. He positioned himself near the back of the sanctuary, waiting until the service came to a close. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed quiet, almost detached, his expression hard to read. Few could have imagined the storm about to break. When the final prayers were spoken and the congregation began to disperse, William moved toward his office, a space where he often counseled parishioners or met with church staff after services. It was there that Daniel followed him. Inside that small office, away from the eyes of the congregation, decades of unspoken rage and unresolved conflict erupted. Voices were raised, words were exchanged. Daniel accused his brother of wronging him, of betraying him, of taking what he believed was rightfully his. To William, these were familiar accusations he had heard before and dismissed as the product of Daniel's troubled mind. But on this day, there would be no calming his younger brother. In an instant, Daniel pulled out a handgun. The confrontation shifted from words to violence. Within seconds, shots rang out, shattering the silence of the church. Reverend William Schooler, the veteran, the educator, the pastor who had given his life to service, was struck multiple times. The office that had once been a place of counsel and prayer became the site of his death. The congregation, startled by the gunfire, rushed to understand what had happened. Panic swept through the sanctuary. Some cried out in disbelief, others dropped to their knees, praying as chaos unfolded around them. In the midst of the confusion, Daniel did not flee. Instead, he stood, weapon still in hand, until church members and eventually law enforcement arrived. For those who witnessed it, the horror was beyond comprehension. A man of God killed in his own church. Not by a stranger, not by an intruder, but by his own brother. That morning, the sanctuary of St. Peter's, once a place of safety and worship, was transformed forever. The sound of gunfire inside a church is something no one ever forgets. The sharp cracks echoed through the sanctuary, cutting through the prayers, the hymns, and the peaceful atmosphere that had filled the room only moments before. Congregants froze in disbelief, their minds struggling to grasp what had just happened. Some screamed, others ran for the exits, while a few rushed toward the pastor's office, desperate to help. When the door opened, the sight that met them was one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Reverend William Schooler lay slumped, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, his body motionless. The man they looked up to as a leader, a counselor, and a father figure had just been struck down in cold blood. And standing only feet away was his own brother, Daniel Schooler, still holding the weapon. There was no attempt to run, no effort to hide. Daniel remained in the room, calm, almost detached, as if the weight of what he had done had not yet settled upon him. Witnesses recalled his blank expression, his quiet demeanor in the moments after the shooting, as though he believed this confrontation had been inevitable. Calls to 911 flooded in from panicked church members. "Our pastor has been shot," one voice cried. Sirens soon pierced the air as Dayton police rushed to the scene. Officers entered the church cautiously, weapons drawn, prepared for the possibility of further violence. What they found, however, was a crime already complete. Reverend William Schooler was pronounced dead at the scene. The sanctuary, once a place of hope and healing, had become a crime scene. Yellow tape sealing off the very halls where the community had gathered for worship just minutes before. Daniel was taken into custody without resistance. Officers reported that he handed over his weapon calmly, showing none of the panic or desperation that often follows such an act. Instead, he seemed resigned, as if he had simply carried out a decision that had been years in the making. For the congregation, the shock was overwhelming. Many wept openly, others clung to each other in disbelief. Children who had once looked up to Reverend Schooler as a guiding light were suddenly confronted with the darkest of realities. Their pastor, their leader, was gone, not by illness, not by accident, but by the hand of his own flesh and blood. Word spread quickly beyond the walls of St. Peter's. News outlets arrived, capturing the stunned faces of church members as they recounted the horror. For the city of Dayton, it was almost impossible to comprehend. How could a man who survived the battlefields of Vietnam, who dedicated his life to education and ministry, be killed in his own church by his own brother? In that moment, the story shifted from tragedy to mystery. What could have driven Daniel Schooler to commit such an act? Was it rage, mental illness, or a lifetime of unresolved conflict? These were the questions that would soon consume investigators, reporters, and the grieving community alike. The arrest was only the beginning. As detectives began piecing together the events that led to the Reverend's death, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a crime born in a single moment. It was the result of decades of tension, bitterness, and conflict within the Schooler family. Daniel Schooler was no stranger to trouble. Records revealed a long and troubled past, marked by disputes, confrontations, and outbursts that often left those around him unsettled. Unlike his older brother William, who built a reputation of dignity and calm leadership, Daniel's life had been shaped by instability and anger. Family members described the brothers as opposites. William was disciplined, a man of faith and service, someone who believed in reconciliation and community. Daniel, on the other hand, carried deep grudges. He felt wronged by life, wronged by his family, and most of all, wronged by William. Detectives learned that the resentment stretched back for years. Daniel believed he had been cheated out of an inheritance, convinced that his brother had wrongfully taken control of property and money that belonged to him. This sense of betrayal festered. With each passing year it grew heavier, darker, transforming into an obsession. And behind it all was another layer: mental illness. Court documents and past records painted a portrait of a man struggling with paranoia and unpredictable behavior. Daniel had previously clashed with law enforcement, and those close to him feared his temper. Yet despite the warning signs, no one imagined that his bitterness would one day erupt inside a church, with his brother as the target. Interviews with those who knew the family revealed the depth of the rift. Congregants recalled that Daniel rarely attended services, and when he did, his presence carried tension rather than peace. Relatives whispered of arguments that had stretched across decades, of grudges that never healed. To Daniel, William wasn't just his brother. He was the symbol of everything Daniel believed he had lost. Investigators pieced together the timeline leading up to that Sunday. Daniel had carried his weapon with him, deliberately walking into St. Peter's as his brother prepared for service. He had waited until William was alone in his office, away from the congregation, before confronting him. The decision was not sudden, it was calculated. But still, the question lingered. Why then? Why, after years of hostility, did Daniel choose that day, that moment in that sacred space? For detectives, the answer lay in Daniel's fractured state of mind. A man already consumed by resentment had reached a breaking point, and in his eyes, justice could only be served with violence. The more the investigators uncovered, the more tragic the story became. A family torn apart not by strangers but by itself. A congregation left not only to mourn their pastor, but to wrestle with the knowledge that the hand that ended his life belonged to his own blood. In the days that followed, the community searched for answers, but one truth was already clear. This murder was not the result of chance. It was the final act in a conflict that had been building for a lifetime. When the case finally moved into the courtroom, the city of Dayton braced itself for what promised to be one of the most emotionally charged trials in its history. The image of a brother standing accused of murdering his own flesh and blood inside a church was something the community could not easily reconcile. Yet inside that courtroom, the focus shifted from grief to the hard task of justice. Daniel Schooler, now in his late 60s, stood before the judge and jury facing charges of murder, felonious assault, and carrying a concealed weapon. His appearance was calm, almost detached, but his past behavior painted a different picture. Prosecutors wasted no time laying out their case. They described how Daniel had walked into St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church armed with a handgun, how he had confronted his brother in the pastor's office, and how he had pulled the trigger multiple times, striking Reverend William B. Schooler as he sat at his desk. The evidence was overwhelming. The weapon was recovered. Eyewitnesses, including church members who had rushed to the office after hearing the gunshots, testified to what they saw in those horrific moments. There was no mystery about who had fired the fatal shots. The only real question was why. The prosecution argued that this was no accident. It was deliberate, born from years of resentment. They painted Daniel as a man who had allowed hatred and jealousy to dominate his life until it culminated in murder. This was not a sudden act, the prosecutor told the jury. It was the result of years of anger, years of blame, and finally, years of planning that ended in tragedy. But the defense told a different story. They did not deny that Daniel had pulled the trigger. Instead, they focused on his mental state. They pointed to a long history of psychological troubles, incidents of paranoia, and a documented record of instability. Their argument was clear. Daniel did not fully comprehend what he was doing. He was not in control of his actions. His mind, they argued, was fractured. Family members, many of them torn between loyalty and heartbreak, took the stand. Some spoke of William's lifelong dedication to peace, unity, and forgiveness. Others revealed the years of tension, the endless disputes over money, property, and family matters. Each testimony added another layer to the already complex picture. In the courtroom, silence often fell heavy when the Reverend's widow was mentioned. She had been preparing to worship with her husband that morning, never imagining she would lose him to the violence of his own brother. For the congregation, the trial was not only about punishment, it was about finding meaning in the senseless. The jury listened carefully, weighed the evidence, and considered the arguments. But no matter how the lawyers framed it, the fact remained unshakable. William Schooler was dead, and Daniel Schooler had killed him. What remained was the question of justice, and what measure of accountability the court would demand from a man whose actions had destroyed his own family and shaken a community to its core. The courtroom was tense when the trial reached its conclusion. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional accounts from family members, it was time for the jury to decide Daniel Schooler's fate. The question was not whether he had killed his brother. That fact was undisputed. The question was how the law would judge a man who had carried out such an act in broad daylight inside the sanctuary of a church against his own flesh and blood. The jury deliberated carefully. They revisited the eyewitness testimonies, the forensic evidence, and the defense's plea regarding Daniel's fragile mental state. But the weight of the crime was undeniable. When the jurors finally returned to the courtroom, every seat was filled and silence swept through the gallery. The verdict was read aloud: guilty of murder, guilty of felonious assault, and guilty of having a weapon under disability. For many, it was the only possible outcome. Reverend William Schooler's widow wept quietly in her seat, her grief compounded by the painful truth that justice against her husband's killer came at the cost of condemning another member of her family. Daniel sat expressionless as the words were read. He neither reacted nor looked toward his relatives in the courtroom. It was as though the gravity of the moment barely touched him, or perhaps it was another sign of the deep disconnect that had been described throughout the trial. With the verdict secured, the case moved into sentencing. The prosecution argued that Daniel's actions demanded the maximum penalty the law could provide. This was not a crime of passion, they reminded the court, but a deliberate act of violence carried out in a place meant for peace. The defense continued to insist that Daniel's mental health struggles should be considered, that his fractured state of mind lessened his responsibility. But the judge's words were final. After weighing the evidence and the tragedy it had caused, Daniel Schooler was sentenced to 31 years to life in prison. He would spend the remainder of his days behind bars, with only the possibility of parole far into the future. For the community, the sentencing marked the end of a painful chapter, but not the end of the sorrow. The memory of Reverend Schooler, a man who had devoted his life to service, who had guided his congregation with faith and compassion, remained heavy in the hearts of those who knew him. His murder was more than a personal loss. It was a wound that stretched across the city of Dayton, a stark reminder of the fragile line between love and hate, and the devastating consequences when family conflicts are left unresolved. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, the contrast between the two brothers could not have been more clear. One remembered as a leader and man of faith, the other condemned for taking that life away.